The morning frost clung to the windshield of Thomas Hartley's delivery truck as he turned onto Maple Avenue in suburban Arlington, Virginia, on a bitterly cold December morning in 1957. The 34-year-old milkman had driven this route for 6 years, delivering fresh dairy to the same families, memorizing their routines with the precision of someone who understood that consistency was the foundation of trust. He believed he knew this neighborhood better than anyone. Every barking dog, every squeaking gate, every household's preference for whole milk or cream. What Thomas couldn't possibly have imagined was that his intimate knowledge of these ordinary suburban rhythms was about to thrust him into the shadowy world of Cold War espionage, transforming his mundane morning delivery into a discovery that would send shockwaves through the Federal Bureau of Investigation and expose one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations on American soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Thomas Hartley had never aspired to be a hero. Born in 1923 in rural Pennsylvania, he'd grown up during the Great Depression, watching his father struggle to keep their small dairy farm afloat. The experience had taught him the value of honest work and the dignity of providing essential services to his community. After serving in the Pacific Theater during World War II as a supply clerk, Thomas had returned home with modest ambitions. He married his high school sweetheart, Dorothy, and when the opportunity arose to work for Cloverdale Dairy in the burgeoning suburbs of Virginia, he'd seized it without hesitation. The pay was steady, the work was honest, and it allowed him to support Dorothy and their 3 young children in a small but comfortable house on the edge of Arlington. His route covered approximately 45 houses in a neighborhood of tidy lawns and white picket fences, where young families were living the American dream. The subdivision had sprouted up after the war, filled with veterans like himself who'd used their benefits to buy starter homes. Thomas knew these families intimately through the small interactions that defined his work. He knew that Mrs. Patterson on Elm Street always left him homemade cookies at Christmas, that the Johnsons' golden retriever would howl at the sound of his truck, and that Mr. Chen, one of the few Asian families in the neighborhood, always waved from his garden on Saturday mornings. This knowledge made Thomas good at his job, but it also made him acutely aware when something was amiss. The house at 1726 Maple Avenue had always struck Thomas as peculiar, though he couldn't quite articulate why. It was a modest 2-story colonial, painted a forgettable shade of gray, identical in construction to dozens of others in the neighborhood, but somehow different in character. The couple who lived there, who'd introduced themselves as Richard and Helen Morrison, had moved in about 18 months earlier. They were quiet, polite, and perfectly unremarkable in every visible way. Richard claimed to be an import-export consultant who traveled frequently for work. Helen was a housewife who kept to herself. They had no children. They ordered 2 bottles of whole milk and 1 of cream every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, like clockwork. What bothered Thomas, though he'd never mentioned it to anyone, was the peculiar stillness of the house. Unlike other homes on his route, which showed the organic chaos of lived lives, bicycles on lawns, toys scattered on porches, curtains drawn at different times, the Morrison house maintained an almost theatrical perfection. The curtains were always drawn in exactly the same position. The newspaper was always retrieved within minutes of delivery. The lawn was immaculately maintained, yet Thomas had never actually seen anyone tending it. In a neighborhood where people chatted over hedges and borrowed cups of sugar, the Morrisons existed in a bubble of polite distance. On that December morning, Thomas arrived at 1726 Maple Avenue at precisely 6:45, as he did every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the street lamps cast pools of yellow light on the frost-covered pavement. He carried 2 bottles of milk in their wire carrier, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. As he approached the front porch, something immediately struck him as wrong. The front door stood slightly ajar, perhaps 3 inches, which was unusual enough, but more concerning was the light he could see coming from somewhere deep inside the house. Not the warm yellow of a lamp, but a harsher, whiter light that seemed to flicker. Thomas hesitated on the porch, the milk bottles clinking softly in his hands. His military training, dormant for years, suddenly reasserted itself. Something wasn't right. He called out a tentative greeting, his voice carrying in the still morning air. There was no response. The house remained silent, except for a faint humming sound he couldn't identify. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, debating whether to simply leave the milk and continue his route. After all, he told himself, it wasn't his business. Maybe they'd simply forgotten to close the door properly when Richard left for one of his frequent trips. But Thomas Hartley was a conscientious man, and the thought of simply walking away from what might be a break-in or some kind of emergency gnawed at him. He set down the milk carrier and gently pushed the door open wider, calling out again, more loudly this time. The door swung inward, revealing the Morrisons' neat living room. Everything appeared normal, furniture in place, no signs of disturbance, except for that strange light emanating from somewhere toward the back of the house. Thomas took a step inside, then another, his heart beginning to pound. The humming sound was louder now, mechanical and steady. He moved through the living room toward the hallway, his boots leaving wet prints on the polished hardwood floor. The light was coming from a door at the end of the hall, which stood partially open. As Thomas approached, he could see it was the door to what he'd assumed was a basement. The white light spilled up the stairs, accompanied now by the distinct sound of what seemed like machinery running. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob. Every instinct told him to leave, to mind his own business, but curiosity and concern pushed him forward. He opened the door fully and began descending the wooden stairs into the basement. What Thomas Hartley discovered in that basement would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because it was violent or grotesque, but because it revealed a reality so at odds with the quiet suburban facade that his entire understanding of the world seemed to shift. The basement had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. The walls were lined with radio equipment, massive transceivers, receivers, and what appeared to be encoding machines. Long spools of paper covered in seemingly random letters hung from one of the devices. A large table in the center of the room held cameras, specialized film development equipment, and what looked like miniaturized photography tools. Another wall featured detailed maps of the Washington area, marked with symbols and annotations in what Thomas didn't immediately recognize as Cyrillic script. The white light came from photographic lamps mounted on stands throughout the space, but the most shocking discovery was the photographs. Scattered across one section of the table were hundreds of photographs of documents, official-looking papers with government seals, blueprints, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be military specifications. Some were still drying on a line strung across one corner of the room. Thomas picked up one photograph with shaking hands. Even with his limited understanding of such matters, he could see the words "Top Secret" stamped across the top of the document it depicted. Thomas stood frozen in the basement for what might have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes. He would never be certain. His mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He thought of the movies he'd seen about spies and saboteurs, stories he'd dismissed as Hollywood fantasy. He thought of the headlines about Soviet espionage that had dominated newspapers for years. The Rosenberg trial, the accusations of communist infiltration. The humming continued, steady and mechanical, from what he now recognized as some kind of transmission equipment. The sound of a car engine in the driveway jolted Thomas from his paralysis. His military training kicked in, replacing shock with action. He turned and ran up the basement stairs, through the hallway, and out the front door with a speed that would have been comical under different circumstances. He left the milk bottles sitting on the porch and sprinted to his truck, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he saw a dark sedan pull into the Morrisons' driveway. Thomas didn't wait to see who emerged. He started the engine and drove away, forcing himself to maintain a normal speed despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. Thomas drove directly to the Cloverdale Dairy Depot, abandoning the rest of his morning route. His supervisor, a portly man named Frank Henderson, looked up in surprise when Thomas burst into the office at 7:15 in the morning, pale and breathing hard. Frank initially thought Thomas had been in an accident or witnessed a crime. In a way, he had, though the crime was of a nature Frank Henderson couldn't begin to comprehend. Thomas tried to explain what he'd seen, his words tumbling out in a disjointed stream. He described the equipment, the photographs, the maps, the strange letters on the papers. Frank listened with growing skepticism, clearly wondering if his usually reliable Milkman had suffered some kind of breakdown. It was only when Thomas insisted with an almost manic urgency that Frank needed to call the police, no, not the police, the FBI, that his supervisor began to take him seriously. Frank had served in the army himself and recognized genuine shock when he saw it. He asked Thomas to sit down, brought him a cup of coffee, and then, more to humor him than anything else, called the Arlington Police Department. Thomas insisted they needed the FBI, not local police, but Frank felt that was above his pay grade. Let the police sort out what needed to happen next. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a skeptical veteran of the force, and his younger partner, Officer James Walsh. Thomas repeated his story, this time trying to be more coherent and precise. He described the location, what he'd seen in the basement, and his conviction that something very wrong was happening at 1726 Maple Avenue. The officers exchanged glances that Thomas interpreted as doubt. O'Brien asked careful questions, his tone patient but clearly unconvinced. Had Thomas been drinking? Was he feeling well? Had he perhaps been working too hard? Thomas felt frustration rising in his chest. He understood their skepticism. His story sounded insane. A Soviet spy hideout in suburban Arlington? Equipment straight out of a spy novel in someone's basement? It was the kind of thing paranoid people claimed to see during the height of the Red Scare. But Thomas Hartley was not paranoid, not prone to flights of fancy. He was a milkman, for God's sake, a man whose entire life was built on routine and reliability. He stood up, looked Sergeant O'Brien in the eye, and said something that would later be quoted in FBI reports. He said he knew what he'd seen, that those photographs had top secret stamped on them, that the equipment was real, and that if they didn't investigate, they would regret it. Something in Thomas's demeanor, perhaps the quiet certainty in his voice or the fact that he was clearly a solid, credible citizen, persuaded O'Brien to take the claim seriously enough to drive to Maple Avenue. The 3 men climbed into the police cruiser and headed toward the Morrison house. During the drive, Thomas's hands shook so badly he had to clasp them together in his lap. He kept thinking about the car that had pulled into the driveway as he fled. What if the Morrisons were home now? What if they'd discovered someone had been in their basement? What if they'd already disappeared? When they arrived at 1726 Maple Avenue at 8:30 in the morning, the house looked exactly as it always did. Quiet, neat, perfectly ordinary. The dark sedan Thomas had seen was parked in the driveway. The front door was now closed. The milk bottles Thomas had left on the porch were gone. Everything appeared completely normal, which somehow made Thomas feel even more unsettled. Had he imagined the open door? Had the whole thing been some kind of bizarre hallucination? Sergeant O'Brien approached the front door with Officer Walsh, while Thomas waited by the patrol car. O'Brien knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the quiet morning. After a moment, the door opened and Helen Morrison appeared, wearing a neat house dress and a polite, slightly puzzled expression. She greeted the officers with the kind of mild concern any normal citizen might display when police appeared at their door. O'Brien explained that they'd received a report of a possible disturbance at the residence and asked if everything was all right. Helen looked genuinely confused. She assured them everything was fine. Her husband was away on business. She'd been home alone all morning. There had been no disturbance of any kind. O'Brien asked if they might look around just to be certain everything was in order. This was the critical moment. Under normal circumstances, Helen Morrison could have refused without a warrant. But refusing would have aroused more suspicion, and Soviet intelligence training emphasized blending in, appearing normal, cooperating with authorities within reason. Helen hesitated for only a fraction of a second before smiling and inviting them in, expressing amused bewilderment at the whole situation. The officers entered the house with Thomas trailing behind, his stomach churning with anxiety. The living room looked exactly as he remembered it, neat, impersonal, like a furniture store display. Helen offered them coffee, which O'Brien politely declined. He asked if they might check the basement, mentioning that the report had specifically concerned the basement area. Again, Helen could have refused, but doing so would have been suspicious. She led them to the basement door, explaining that there wasn't much down there, just storage and Richard's amateur radio equipment. Her husband was a ham radio enthusiast, she said, a hobby he'd picked up during the war. When Helen opened the basement door and descended the stairs ahead of the officers, Thomas held his breath. But when they reached the bottom and the lights came on, Thomas felt his world tilt on its axis. The basement was completely different. Gone were the sophisticated transceivers, the encoding machines, the photographs, the maps with Cyrillic annotations. Instead, there sat a modest amateur radio setup, the kind thousands of Americans had in their basements, along with some storage boxes, a workbench, and various household items. It looked utterly, completely normal. Helen explained that Richard had left the radio equipment running when he'd departed for his trip, which explained any humming sounds. She showed them the license certificate on the wall, proving Richard Morrison was a registered amateur radio operator, call sign W3RPM. Thomas stood in the middle of that transformed basement, feeling a cold dread wash over him. He knew what he'd seen. The equipment, the photographs, the maps, they'd been real. But now they were gone, replaced with this carefully constructed facade of normalcy. He understood in that moment that he'd stumbled onto something far more sophisticated than he'd imagined. The Morrisons, or whoever they really were, had somehow known he'd reported what he'd seen. They'd had time, perhaps an hour, perhaps less, to strip the basement of its incriminating contents and replace it with a convincing alternative. The efficiency and speed of the transformation spoke to professional training and preparation. Sergeant O'Brien turned to Thomas with an expression that mixed sympathy and irritation. He clearly believed Thomas had either made an honest mistake or wasted police time. He apologized to Helen Morrison for the intrusion, thanked her for her cooperation, and ushered Thomas and Officer Walsh back upstairs. Helen followed them to the door, her demeanor remaining polite and slightly puzzled. As they left, she even smiled at Thomas and said she hoped he felt better soon, a comment that could have been innocent concern or a calculated message that she knew exactly who had reported them. In the patrol car, Sergeant O'Brien lectured Thomas about the seriousness of false reports and the waste of police resources. But something in Thomas's continued insistence, and the fact that he was clearly not crazy or malicious, gave O'Brien pause. He agreed to file a report and suggested that if Thomas really believed he'd witnessed something suspicious, he should contact the FBI directly. It was clear O'Brien thought nothing would come of it, that this would end up as one of those strange incidents that got filed away and forgotten. He dropped Thomas back at the dairy depot and drove away, the matter seemingly closed. But Thomas Hartley was not ready to let it go. He spent the rest of that day in a state of agitated determination. He called the FBI's Washington field office from a payphone, worried that somehow his home phone might be compromised. The agent who answered initially treated his call with the same skepticism the police had shown, but Thomas was persistent. He provided specific details, the exact address, descriptions of what he'd seen, his theory about how quickly the basement had been cleared. Something in his detailed account, or perhaps the specific mention of Cyrillic writing and sophisticated radio equipment, triggered a different response. The agent asked Thomas to stay on the line, then transferred him to another agent, then another. By the fourth transfer, Thomas was speaking with someone who asked very specific, very technical questions about the equipment he'd seen. The agent, who identified himself only as Special Agent Morrison, a coincidence that wasn't lost on Thomas, arranged to meet him the following morning at a diner in Alexandria, well away from Thomas's usual route and neighborhood. Thomas spent a sleepless night, lying awake beside Dorothy, who'd grown increasingly worried about his agitated state. He hadn't told her everything, just that he'd witnessed something strange at work and needed to speak with the authorities. Dorothy Hartley knew her husband well enough to recognize when he was genuinely troubled, rather than merely stressed, and she held him close in the darkness, asking no questions. The next morning, Thomas sat in a booth at Angelo's diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold, when two men in dark suits entered. They spotted him immediately. He'd told them he'd be wearing his Cloverdale dairy jacket and slid into the booth across from him. The older man, perhaps 50, with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw, introduced himself as Special Agent Robert Kellerman. His partner, younger and quieter, was Special Agent David Chen. The presence of an Asian-American FBI agent surprised Thomas, but he said nothing. These were different times, he reminded himself, even if change came slowly. For the next 2 hours, Thomas recounted everything he'd seen in excruciating detail. The agents listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in small leather notebooks. They asked him to describe the radio equipment as precisely as possible, the layout of the basement, the types of photographs he'd seen, anything he could remember about the maps. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to recreate the scene in his mind, describing the placement of equipment, the color of wires, the size and model of what he could see. He mentioned the photographs of documents with top-secret markings, the blueprints, the technical diagrams. When he finished, Agent Kellerman sat back and exchanged a long look with Agent Chen. Then Kellerman did something unexpected. He thanked Thomas, told him his information was valuable, and asked if he'd be willing to help the FBI further. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He asked what they needed. Kellerman explained that if the Morrisons were indeed what the FBI suspected, Soviet intelligence operatives running a spy operation, then they would have gone to ground after discovering their security had been compromised. But they couldn't simply abandon their mission or their cover. They'd be watching, waiting to see if there would be any follow-up. The FBI needed to conduct surveillance, but they needed to do it carefully, without alerting the targets. Thomas could help by doing exactly what he'd been doing for 6 years, delivering milk to 1726 Maple Avenue as if nothing had happened. His presence on the street would be completely normal, raising no suspicions, but now he'd be trained to notice certain things, to report specific details. He'd be, in effect, an FBI informant, though they wouldn't use that word. They'd call him a concerned citizen assisting a federal investigation. The request filled Thomas with a mixture of fear and pride. He'd served his country in the Pacific, but this was different. This was personal, happening in his neighborhood on his route. He agreed without hesitation. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas Hartley became an unlikely participant in a sophisticated FBI counterintelligence operation. Special Agent Kellerman and his team established surveillance on the Morrison house, but they did so with extreme caution. They couldn't afford to spook their targets, who were almost certainly trained Soviet intelligence officers with years of experience in evading detection. The FBI rented an apartment across the street and installed observers with cameras and listening equipment. They tapped the Morrisons' phone line. They began investigating the couple's background, tracking their movements, identifying their contacts. Thomas continued his milk deliveries 3 times a week, maintaining his normal schedule and routine. The FBI had given him specific things to watch for: visitors to the house, unusual activity at odd hours, packages being delivered or picked up, any changes in the Morrisons' behavior. He was to make mental notes and report them during regular meetings with Agent Chen at the diner in Alexandria. The Morrisons continued to receive their milk, continued to pay their bill promptly, and Helen occasionally appeared at the door with her polite smile and bland pleasantries. To all appearances, they were exactly what they claimed to be, an ordinary couple living an ordinary suburban life. But the FBI's investigation was uncovering something quite different. Richard Morrison's business trips, they discovered, consistently coincided with the presence of known Soviet intelligence officers in various cities. The import-export business he claimed to run had no verifiable existence beyond a registered business name and a post office box. Their financial records, when the FBI finally obtained them through legal channels, showed income sources that didn't match Richard's claimed employment. Most damning, a review of security logs at several government facilities in Washington revealed that a man matching Richard's description had been seen in the vicinity on multiple occasions, often in the company of individuals who had access to classified information. The FBI learned that Richard and Helen Morrison were almost certainly aliases for 2 Soviet illegals, deep cover agents who'd entered the United States years earlier with false identities and had been carefully building their cover story while recruiting sources and gathering intelligence. The sophisticated equipment Thomas had seen in their basement was consistent with what the FBI knew about Soviet intelligence operations. The rapid removal and replacement of that equipment demonstrated a level of preparation that suggested the Morrisons had contingency plans for exactly such an emergency. In late January of 1958, the FBI made its move. They'd gathered enough evidence through surveillance and investigation to obtain warrants for the arrest of Richard and Helen Morrison on charges of espionage. The operation was planned with military precision. Agents surrounded the house on Maple Avenue at 4 in the morning, when the neighborhood was dark and quiet. They had a battering ram ready to break down the door if necessary, but it turned out the Morrisons were already awake, perhaps alerted by some sixth sense developed through years of operating in hostile territory. When agents burst through the front door, they found Richard Morrison sitting calmly at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. Helen was upstairs, already dressed. Both surrendered without resistance. The basement, when agents flooded down the stairs, was empty and clean, just as it had appeared during the police visit weeks earlier. But this time the FBI had more time and more resources. They began a methodical search of the entire property, and what they found validated everything Thomas Hartley had reported and more. Hidden throughout the house were classic tools of espionage: a hollow flashlight battery containing microfilm, a modified shaving cream can with a secret compartment, specialized cameras disguised as ordinary objects, one-time pads for encoding messages, and a shortwave radio hidden in a modified stereo console. In the garage, beneath a false floor under the workbench, agents discovered what they'd been looking for: the sophisticated radio equipment Thomas had described, along with files of photographed documents, maps, and encoding materials. The Morrisons had moved the incriminating equipment after Thomas's discovery, but they hadn't had time to remove it from the property entirely. They'd simply hidden it better, betting that a cursory police inspection wouldn't uncover their carefully constructed hiding places. The subsequent investigation and trial revealed the extent of the Morrisons' operation. Their real names were Viktor Alexandrovich Petrov and Anna Mikhailovna Orlova, both career KGB officers who'd been inserted into the United States in the mid-1940s. They'd spent years building their cover identities, establishing themselves as unremarkable suburban residents while cultivating sources within various government agencies. The documents Thomas had seen photographs of included classified information from the State Department, the Department of Defense, and early research into missile technology. The FBI estimated that the Petrov-Orlova team had been responsible for transmitting hundreds of classified documents to Moscow over more than a decade. The trial, when it finally occurred in late 1958, became a sensation. Though the government carefully controlled what information was released to the public, Thomas Hartley testified about his discovery, describing in calm, precise language what he'd seen in the basement that December morning. Defense attorneys attempted to discredit him, suggesting he'd been confused or mistaken, but the physical evidence supported his account completely. The photographs, maps, and equipment found hidden in the house matched his descriptions exactly. Viktor Petrov, when he testified in his own defense, claimed they were merely amateur radio enthusiasts who'd been persecuted due to Cold War paranoia. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Both were convicted on multiple counts of espionage and conspiracy. Viktor Petrov was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Anna Orlova received 25 years. The case made headlines for weeks, though much of the most sensitive information about their activities remained classified. Thomas Hartley found himself briefly famous, featured in newspaper articles as the alert citizen who'd helped expose a major Soviet spy ring. The attention made him deeply uncomfortable. He gave one interview to the Washington Post, describing his actions in modest terms, emphasizing that he'd simply been doing his duty. After that, he refused all media requests, wanting only to return to his normal life. But returning to normal proved impossible. The FBI commended Thomas for his assistance and presented him with a certificate of appreciation from Director J. Edgar Hoover himself. Cloverdale Dairy gave him a bonus and a new delivery route in a different neighborhood. His choice, as he found, he couldn't continue driving past 1726 Maple Avenue without reliving that morning. The new owners of the house, a young couple with 2 small children, seemed nice enough, but Thomas couldn't shake the memory of what he'd discovered in their basement. The experience changed Thomas in ways both subtle and profound. He found himself looking at his neighbors differently, wondering what secrets might hide behind their neat facades. The Cold War, which had previously been something he read about in newspapers or saw in newsreels, had become viscerally real. He understood now that the conflict between East and West wasn't just happening in distant places like Berlin or Korea. It was happening here, in American suburbs, fought by people who looked like neighbors and friends. The certainty he'd once felt about being able to distinguish the ordinary from the extraordinary, the trustworthy from the dangerous, had been shattered. Dorothy noticed the change in her husband. He became more vigilant, more watchful, less inclined to take things at face value. She worried about him, this man who'd always been so steady and uncomplicated, now carrying the weight of knowledge that troubled his sleep. But she also saw something else, a quiet pride in having done something important, in having been brave when bravery was required. Thomas had always been a good man, honest and hard-working, but he'd sometimes wondered if his life mattered beyond providing for his family. Now he knew it did. His vigilance, his willingness to report what he'd seen despite the risk of being dismissed as paranoid or foolish, had potentially saved countless secrets and possibly lives. The FBI kept in touch with Thomas for several years after the trial. Occasionally, Agent Kellerman would stop by for coffee, ostensibly just to check in but really to debrief Thomas about anything unusual he might have noticed on his routes. Thomas understood he'd been flagged as someone with good instincts and attention to detail, someone who could be trusted. He took a certain satisfaction in this, though he never spoke about it outside his immediate family. The only people who knew the full story were Dorothy, Agent Kellerman, and a handful of FBI personnel involved in the case. Years later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and some of the classified files from the case were declassified, historians would study the Petrov-Orlova operation as a textbook example of Soviet illegal operations in the United States during the height of the Cold War. Academic papers would be written about their tradecraft, their network of sources, and the intelligence they'd successfully transmitted to Moscow. Some scholars would note that the operation's exposure came not through sophisticated counterintelligence work or code breaking, but through the simple observation of an alert milkman who noticed that something was wrong and had the courage to report it. Thomas Hartley lived to see the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He watched these events on television with a complex mixture of relief and reflection. The enemy he'd helped fight against had collapsed, not through military confrontation, but through the weight of its own contradictions. He wondered sometimes about Victor and Anna, whether they'd lived long enough to see their cause fail, whether they ever regretted the choices they'd made. He'd seen them only once after the trial, glimpsed through a courthouse window as they were being transported to federal prison. They'd looked diminished somehow, stripped of the elaborate fiction that had been the Morrison identity, reduced to their essential selves. He never learned what happened to them after their imprisonment. Sometimes he imagined they'd been exchanged in some spy swap, returned to Moscow to live out their days in obscurity. Other times he thought they might have remained in American prisons, forgotten footnotes to the great conflict that had defined an era. It didn't really matter. What mattered was that he'd done what was right when it counted, that he'd trusted his instincts and his sense of duty over the easier path of looking away. Thomas retired from Cloverdale Dairy in 1983 after 30 years of service. His retirement party featured cake, speeches from management, and a gold watch. None of his co-workers knew the full story of what he'd done in 1957, though rumors had circulated for years. He gave a brief speech thanking everyone for their friendship and support, making no mention of the events that had briefly made him famous. That night, at home with Dorothy and their grown children, he finally told the complete story, filling in details he'd never shared with anyone except the FBI. His children listened in amazement, seeing their ordinary father in a new light. The broader implications of the Petrov-Orlova case extended far beyond the prosecution of 2 Soviet agents. The FBI used information gathered during the investigation to identify and monitor other potential Soviet operatives operating under similar cover. The documents recovered from the Morrison house, combined with Victor's eventual cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence, helped American counterintelligence understand Soviet illegal operations with unprecedented clarity. The case became a training tool for FBI agents, illustrating both the sophistication of Soviet intelligence operations and the value of ordinary citizens in defending national security. For Thomas, the most lasting impact was a deeper appreciation for the fragility of the ordinary world he'd taken for granted. He understood that the quiet suburbs, the daily routines, the predictable rhythms of American life existed in a context of larger struggles and hidden conflicts. The peace and prosperity he'd fought for in the Pacific, that he worked to maintain through his honest labor, had to be defended constantly, often in ways invisible to most citizens. Sometimes that defense came through grand military or diplomatic actions, but sometimes it came through the simple act of noticing when something was wrong and having the courage to speak up. In his later years, Thomas occasionally spoke to school groups about his experience, usually at the request of history teachers who'd heard the story. He kept his remarks brief and modest, emphasizing the importance of civic responsibility and vigilance. He told students that being a good citizen meant more than just obeying laws and paying taxes. It meant paying attention, trusting your instincts, and being willing to take action when you witnessed something wrong. The students often seemed disappointed that he didn't have more dramatic stories of car chases or shootouts. Thomas would smile and explain that real courage was often quiet and undramatic: a phone call to authorities, a willingness to testify, a determination to see justice done despite the easier path of looking away. The house at 1726 Maple Avenue changed hands several times over the decades. Each new family arrived unaware of its history, decorating the rooms and living their lives in spaces that had once harbored one of the Cold War's most sophisticated espionage operations. The basement was refinished, turned into a family room with paneling and carpet. The concrete floor where sophisticated radio equipment had once sat now covered by children's toys and laundry. No trace remained of its previous use, except in FBI files and the memories of those who'd been involved in the case. Thomas Hartley passed away in 2006 at the age of 83, with Dorothy at his side. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service, his long career with Cloverdale Dairy, and his survival by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. It made no mention of the morning in December 1957 when he discovered a Soviet spy hideout, though a handful of aging FBI agents and intelligence historians noted his passing with quiet respect. To the end of his life, Thomas remained characteristically modest about his role in the affair, insisting to anyone who asked that he'd simply done what any decent person would have done. But those who studied the case understood differently. In the complex, shadowy world of Cold War espionage, where trained professionals on both sides deployed sophisticated technology and elaborate tradecraft, the entire Petrov-Orlova operation had been compromised by something the Soviets couldn't have anticipated or defended against: the detailed, intimate knowledge that a milkman had of his route, his customers, and the subtle rhythms of ordinary suburban life. Victor and Anna had been trained to deceive intelligence professionals, to evade surveillance, to maintain their cover under the scrutiny of counterintelligence officers. They'd never imagined that their carefully constructed facade would be penetrated by someone whose job it was to notice when milk orders changed or front doors were left open. The case illustrated a fundamental truth about intelligence work that often got lost in the glamour and mythology of espionage. Success in the shadowy world of spies and secrets often came down to seemingly mundane details: a door left ajar, a routine broken, a pattern noticed by someone who understood what normal looked like. The most sophisticated technology, the most elaborate cover stories, the most rigorous training could all be undone by simple human observation and the courage to report what seemed wrong. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.